我们讨论古希腊的民族，古希腊的民族与当代的民族有最大的区别是什么？我的意思是，与西方选举民主最大的区别是什么？
Direct and indirect.
对啊，是古希腊的民主是直接民主 （direct democracy），对不对？公民直接决定他们的 community 的政策，但是现在西方选举民主是间接民主 （indirect democracy）。间接民主的特色是什么？间接民主和直接民主区别到底是什么？啊？什么？对，代议制，所以代议制是什么意思？对，所以不是直接老百姓或者公民会选一些代表，然后是这些代表来决定他们的国家的政策，对不对？ So it moved from direct to indirect democracy. 当然跟国家的规模有关系，因为古希腊的 city state 很小，对不对？但是现在的国家挺大，不可能有所有的，反正可能性比较麻烦。如果要每个政策要让所有的老百姓参加，很麻烦，对不对？当然有人说现在通过网络可以这样的做一些决定，但是总体来说，现在西方民主是间接民主 ，OK？ 间接民主，representative or indirect democracy 有两种辩护。There are two main justifications, okay? One is the natural law justification, and the most famous defender of natural law justification for indirect democracy is John Locke. So now we will look at John Locke's theory. And then arguably the other main justification for indirect democracy is utilitarian 功利主义. And the most famous defender of that form of indirect democracy is we looked at him already, our friend John Stuart Mill. So today we will continue with the natural law justification of democracy, indirect democracy. After that, we look at John Stuart Mill's utilitarian justification for indirect democracy. And then we will conclude by looking at contemporary defenses of 贤能政治 or political meritocracy. And it's good to go from Mill to political meritocracy because we're going to see that Mills really was very much concerned with how to take the best of, we can call it 贤能政治 and democracy and combine them, 结合起来. And I think that's what contemporary defenders of political meritocracy also try to do. But let's first look at John Locke. And John Locke, he begins with a very simple question. You know, he was born in, these are his years. He was born in 1632 and died in 1704. And basically, it's a kind of modern question that he begins with. Because most of ancient political thought, for example, Aristotle and Plato, they're very much concerned with the question of who should rule. 怎么选拔，怎么提拔比较优秀的领导，比较优秀的统治者. That was their main question. But John Locke said, well, actually, an even more important question is why obey the state? 为什么要服从国家？这个问题也很重要，但是古代的学者，不管是中国还是西方，基本上没有回答这个问题。Okay? So John Locke says, this is the most fundamental question in political philosophy. This is the one that I'm going to try to answer, okay? Most of the thinkers in ancient political philosophy, at least in the Western tradition, not including Plato and Aristotle, most of them assume that our political obligations are simply inherited, or more commonly, we need to accept them as God's will. 因为是上帝的决定，所以我要服从国家. Okay? Because you have to remember that most of Western history, starting from about 2,000 years ago, was mainly influenced by Christianity. Christianity, of course, has a belief that God is the ultimate decision maker, and it's quite the idea that God decides our political lives was also commonly held, and therefore we should just obey whoever claims to represent God. And the Catholic Church had a lot of power in most of Western history. So that was a simple, relatively simple answer. Why obey the state? Well, because it's God's will. 因为是上帝的决定，所以我要服从国家。But things changed starting in about the 17th or the 16th century. Well, especially from the 17th century. One reason is that there were religious civil wars. Different interpretations of religions were fighting it out. Who represents God's will? Is it this side or that side? It wasn't so clear, right? 不同的党派在打战，所以应该服从谁不是很清楚。So, very slowly came to believe that political obligations must be voluntarily incurred. 为什么要服从国家呢？因为我同意。I consented. It's my choice. I'm an ordinary citizen. I'm the one who decides if I should obey the state. So we need to construct a political theory that shows how our obligations to obey the state came from ordinary citizens. Now that question was not asked in Chinese political thinking until the 19th century, mainly under the influence of the West. But in the West, it began to be a very important question starting from the 17th century. And these English political philosophers, the two most famous, are Hobbes and Locke. They answered that the state is there. It's a kind of organization which is there to provide services for the state. 可以说是国家是为人民服务. And we obey the state because it's in our self-interest to do so. The state provides good services for me. Therefore, I obey the state because it's in my self-interest to do so. Now, what do we mean by self-interest? Hobbes was an earlier thinker, and he had a very straightforward answer. He said, maybe we all have different ideas about what's in our self-interest, but we can all agree on one thing. Nobody wants to die, especially nobody wants to die a violent death at the hands of others, okay? 我们都同意这方面, okay? So the purpose of the state, the whole purpose of the state for Hobbes is to secure people's interest in the right to life, 生存的权利, and especially to secure people's interest in not being subject to violent death at the hands of other people. So that's a pretty straightforward idea. So if the state manages to protect our right to life, we have an obligation to obey the state. It's pretty straightforward. And the other implication is that if the state does not protect our right to life, then we can disobey the state. So for example, Hobbes He favored a strong state, one that basically did not protect what we consider to be other important rights today, like the freedom of speech, or the right to health care, or the right to education. Those were not relevant. What matters is the right to life, and the strong state, which he called the Leviathan, was the best state to protect the right to life. And don't argue about that. 有人比较 Hobbes 和韩非子，因为 they both want a very strong state, but it's different justification. For Hobbes, it's because it secures our basic interest in living, in our right to life. For Han Feizi, it's not because of individual interests. It's more because of increasing the power of the state, right? 所以法家和 Hobbes 的思想还是有一些区别。But Hobbes says explicitly that if the state no longer protects the right to life, I am no longer under an obligation to obey the state. So he objects to the death penalty. Because the death penalty, by definition, it's the state killing people, right? The state cannot kill people, no matter what kind of people, if the only purpose of the state is to protect the right to life. So Hobbes was against the death penalty. But other than that, he favored a very strong state. Locke, we're going to see, he had a broader conception of basic human interests. He agreed we have a right to life, but he also says we have a right to liberty, a basic need, a basic interest in freedom, and a basic interest in property. In the Western tradition, his argument about the basic interest of property is the most controversial. Not many thinkers in the West criticize the view that we have a basic interest in life and a basic interest in liberty. But the property argument is the most controversial. Now, Rawls has a somewhat different view, right? For Rawls, we have moral duties, that the state is necessary for us to discharge moral duties, like securing justice. For utilitarians, it's a moral duty to secure happiness. But these are not, this is we look at next week. 我们下个礼拜讨论这些。今天主要是讨论这些。Especially Hobbes' argument, because Hobbes was so influential. 你们看媒体，如果你们想知道美国的主流政治文化是什么，我真的觉得80%是从 Locke 的思想来的。你一定要理解 Locke 的理论，才可以理解为什么美国人会这么想，真的。所以我们会看这方面，好吗？ I mean, I'm from, 我是加拿大人，加拿大人也觉得看这些美国政治文化觉得有点奇怪。Everybody has the right to bear arms. Everybody has the right to a gun. 我们觉得神经病这些美国人为什么这么想？我们会看跟 Locke 的理论有直接的关系 ，OK？ 所以如果我们先理解 Locke 的理论，才可以理解美国人会怎么想，政治方面的价值观是什么 ，OK？ So, again, if the state no longer secures the purposes for which it was created, the rights to life, the rights to liberty, and the rights to property, then we can rebel. Okay, we have a right to rebel. That's so important in Locke's theory. 造反的权利，我们会讲。We'll come back to that later. Now let's look at John Locke. Has anybody been to Oxford? 你们去过英国的牛津吗？有人去过吗？ Anyway, if you go to Oxford one day, it's still very beautiful. You still have the same colleges that John Locke attended. He was a student in medicine. He attended Christ Church College in Oxford. If you visit it, you'll see the big painting of John Locke among many other famous students. So he was educated at Christ Church College in Oxford, but he was too radical for his day. So he fled into exile in 1683. he went to Holland, 荷兰，因为当时是最宽容的国家。And then he returned to England after the Glorious Revolution, 光明革命, which basically defeated an absolute monarchy and restored a kind of democratic, constitutional form of government that included a balance of power between the monarch, the nobility, and the common people, 老百姓. Now, what's very interesting is that his most famous political book, The Two Treatises, was published in 1690 after he returned to England and after the Glorious Revolution. And basically, Locke's work, The Two Treatises of Government, is a defense of the form of government that was established after 1688. So, until very recently, most thinkers 大家都以为 Locke 是很保守的学者，因为他的目标是为了辩护这个 Glorious Revolution。但是1950年的时候，有一个英国的学者发现 Locke 其实这本书是 Glorious Revolution 之前写的，所以他非常 radical, you know? He's one of the few political theorists who in his own life, he wrote a very radical critique of the status quo, and then things changed in accordance with his theory, and then he could publish his book. So it's very interesting. Only later did we find out that he was a very radical critic of the political status quo, not a conservative defender, because his book was published before the Glorious Revolution, not after. So the political purpose of the book was not to defend constitutional, democratic form of government. It was really to oppose absolutist monarchy. So that it was a very radical critique in his own day. Now, the first treatise, 正义论, the first one was a critique of monarchy. The second one is a defense of constitutional democracy. This is the most famous part because today hardly anybody wants to defend absolute monarchy. So it seems a bit unnecessary to waste so much time criticizing a system that nobody seeks to defend. Absolute monarchy 主要是 就是一个人说了算的制度, okay? The first treatise is a critique of that, and there was a defender of a monarchical form of government called Sir Robert Filmer. He was a very strong defender of ultra-royalist political theory, meaning he defended the view that the king should decide everything on his own. But now, you still have monarchy now in the UK, right? But it's symbolic monarchy, right? Symbolic monarchy. So the real power holders are the elected decision makers. Like in the UK now, it's Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his political party. The Queen is a symbol, right? But before 1688, before that, it was absolute monarchy, where the king had both absolute power and symbolic power. So what was his theory? He had a theory, Sir Robert Filmer, that the reason that we should obey the absolute monarch is because they have a divine right to rule. It comes from God. And he even constructed a whole theory about how the very first male in the human Bible was Adam, right? Adam and Eve story, right? And that the current, he constructed a theory that tried to prove that the king was a direct descendant of Adam. 是一种家谱, 他觉得当时的皇帝就是 Adam 的后代, That's the Robert Filmer theory. So, John Locke, he wrote, John Locke wrote a very long work criticizing this view, showing that it's historically inaccurate. 他说历史方面不可能是这样的。So basically, his motive was to criticize absolute monarchy and saying that he's not against monarchy per se, but it should be more symbolic. So the second, let's go a bit back. Now let's start the discussion of the defense of constitutional we can say it's liberal democracy. What's liberal about it is that it's based on rights, the rights to life, liberty, and property. And democracy, meaning that the ultimate power lies in the citizens, in the people, in the majority of the people. And constitutional, meaning that there's a rule of law that constrains this democratic element to a certain extent. How does he come to a defense of this? Well, he begins with the state of nature, 自然状态，这是什么意思呢？就是无政府的情况。There's no government, okay? So remember we discussed, 比如说我们3000年我们在内蒙古见面讨论我们要建立什么样的政府呢？这是无政府，这是自然状态。There's no government. And we all meet and we decide we want to establish a government that has power over us. How do we decide that form of government? It has to be a government that is in our interest. 这样的政府应该为我们服务 ，OK？ 如果我们可以建立这样的政府，那我们可以服从这样的政府。Now for Hobbes, he says the state of nature is man's natural condition, and he said it was a situation of a war of all against all, meaning because there's no government, so we are always at war with each other. Why? Not necessarily because we're selfish, but because we don't know what other people really think. Okay? 比如说王承烧，我现在不知道他想什么，他也不知道我想什么。我真的不知道你想什么。我可以怀疑，但是我不一定知道，对不对？所以，如果我们没有政府的话，怎么办？他可能担心我会打他，我也担心他会打我。所以，如果我有机会，我会打他。结果呢，如果有机会，他也会打我。So it becomes a war of all against all because we don't know what other people are thinking, and to be safe, we have to try to establish power over other people. Everybody thinks the same way. The result is that our lives, Hobbes famously said, are nasty, brutish, and short. It's against, everybody has a terrible situation. Nobody knows what other people are thinking. We're always carrying out preemptive strikes against other people. Preemptive strike, 我不知道怎么翻译。Preemptive strike. So we don't know what other people are thinking, so 我们都先发制人，意思清楚吗？ Yeah. So only the fear of death, because we all fear death, especially violent death at the hands of other people, that's why we establish a government, a state, according to Hobbes. Locke is different. Locke says no. The state of nature is the condition in which God places all men in this world. And it's a kind of moral situation, 有一些美德，有一些道德的内容， Rational men live in accordance with freedom and equality, according to the law of nature. We're all moral equals, and we should all have some freedom in his view. It comes from God, but it's something that could also be rationally argued for, he believed. But it's still not stable, 还是不稳定，所以我们还是需要建立国家。OK， 我们会看。So this is Hobbes. He says, this is Locke. He says, and here we have the plain difference between the state of nature and the state of war. Men living together according to reason, we're all equals, we're all free, without a common superior on earth, that means without a state, with authority to judge between them is properly the state of nature. So it's still a kind of rational and moral order, but there's no state. But force, or a declared design of force upon the person of another, where there is no common superior on earth to appeal to them for relief, is the state of war. So, even though it's a moral universe, we're all equals, we're all free according to the law of God, but there's no, if we have a conflict between us, there's no state. So we don't know what could happen. We could start fighting each other. So it also becomes a state of war. That's why we need a state. So 他承认历史方面没有自然状态. We're going to see. It doesn't matter if it's there in history or not, but it's possible that it was there. And because of that, we need to think about why we established a state, why we came to form a state. 这些都是 and the basic problem is that in a state of nature, there's no security. 在自然的状态，完全是大家都觉得很危险，因为没有国家。虽然我们大家都很平等，都很自由，但是如果有冲突的话，可能还是会发现一些暴力，所以我们都觉得很不舒服，所以我们要建立一个国家，主要是这个意思。In a law of nature, with Hobbes it's different, right? There is rights to life, liberty, and property. These rights derive from the law of God, so there's a big debate now among thinkers whether Locke was fundamentally religious or not. Basically, he was both. Yes, he was religious, but he also thought that these rights to life, liberty, and property could be rationally justified. They follow from the dictates of reason. And that they are universal. 是普世的价值观. They have a foundation independent of the laws of any particular society. 是一种的普世价值观，我们可以用这些普世的价值观来判断所有的国家、所有的社会。如果这些国家不符合，如果这些国家破坏我们的权利、生存权利、自由权利和财产权利，这个国家缺乏合法性。OK， 这是 Locke 的理论。The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, you'll see very similar language in the American Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So this is a universal law. 你不可以伤害别人，不可以破坏他们的生存权利。可以说 health 可以说健康，自由 or possession 财产。Okay? For men, being of all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, that's God, 他讲这是上帝，对不对？ All the servants of one sovereign master, God, sent into the world by his order and about his business. They are His property. We are God's property. And God gave us the rights to life, liberty, and property, whose workmanship they are made to last during His, not one another's pleasure. It's because of God that we are like this. And He gave us some faculties. He gave us rationality, sharing in one community of nature. There cannot be supposed any such subordination among us. 我们都平等，没有一个人说因为那个人比那个人重要，大家都有平等的价值。Everybody has the same equal moral value, fundamental to the whole discourse of human rights today, of liberalism. Actually, you have similar views, some people argue, in Confucianism, but it's not so explicit. 大家都很平等. That may authorize us to destroy one another as if we're made for one another's uses. Nobody is a means, as Immanuel Kant put it, nobody is a means to another person's ends. 我们都不是别人的手段. We're all ends in ourselves. As the inferior ranks of creatures are for ours. Every human being is equal, has equal moral worth. In one Christian view, it's put this way, that we are all equal before the eyes of God. Okay? That's a fundamental Christian view, and he takes it for granted here. Now, okay, we all have equal right to life. That's fine, right? 但是一般来说，没有人会说 this person's life is worth more than that person. We all have equal rights to liberty. That's more standard view in liberal societies. But what about the right to property? 他为什么觉得财产是那么重要？这个比较很多人反正有争论，包括在西方很多学者，尤其是左派的学者都反对，包括罗尔斯，对不对？ Rawls, of course, doesn't think we have a natural right to property. Locke argues that the individual, why do we have a right to property? Why does he say that? He says that the individual is entitled to material resources that are the direct product of labor. 可以说安老分配. Basically, if I work hard, look, simple idea, right? If 如果我种菜 Right, 然后我都是我自己的劳动，那这些苹果是我的苹果, okay? That's basically, this is what he means. If I work hard for my labor, I deserve, I own, I have a right to the products of that labor. The earth is held in common, 因为都是上帝给我们的. The individual mixes his labor with it, and then the product becomes his private property. So, if I find a piece, 如果我去没有国家的地方，我种菜，然后这些，比如说这些苹果都是我的苹果，都是我的财产，都是我的私有财产。That's in a way, it's a simple argument, intuitively appealing. Well, of course, until you start. Remember Karl Marx's argument, which Rawls picked up, is that, well, people don't deserve to be born with more natural talent than others, right? But Locke didn't consider that argument. So a famous Canadian political theorist called C.B. Macpherson, he said Locke is an apologist for capitalism. Okay, 他承认他目标不是为了he's very radical, 他想批评 absolute monarchy, 但是他对资本主义，他想辩护资本主义，因为那时候是资本主义慢慢来开始，对不对？反正在西方。His theory, he argued, was designed to justify economic inequalities of the emerging capitalist system. Of course, that's a more Marxist interpretation of his motivation. But it's not so simple, actually. Locke himself, he doesn't defend all forms of actually existing property. In fact, he was quite critical. He's, in theory, 表面上, or 理论上, I own things that I make with my own work. But in a system that has money, much of the property that is distributed is undeserved. It doesn't come from my hard work. It comes because I have money. Or maybe I inherited money from my family, right? He also says that enough resources must be left for others. If I take all the land and work hard, and then you have no land for yourself, that's unfair. I have to leave enough resources for others to be able to work hard and to have enough money and property to exist. The individual can take what he wants so long as others are not made worse off. So that's very different than capitalism, right? 资本主义的国家没有这些前提 right? 资本主义的国家按照市场我可以赚钱就可以了，对不对？ Locke is different. Locke 可以说这方面是偏左, You can only take property if you leave enough for other people and if you do not make others worse off. So it's very qualified property right. And he says we must not let them spoil needlessly. 不可以浪费资源。如果我浪费资源，我没有权利，我没有财产权利。So it's still very qualified right to property, not a defense of capitalism. I think Macpherson here, 他有一点过分。Again, his main political intention was to refute royal claims to his subjects' possessions, because the absolute king thought that the whole of the country was his own possession. Why did he discuss the right to property? Because he wanted to criticize the view that the king had property over the whole country. And he explicitly says that men have the right to physical subsistence. 大家都有可以说生存权, okay? And to a decent standard of living if they work hard. 如果我比较努力，我也有一些如果我努力的工作，我还是有一些权享受体现的生活标准。Okay? So he's not defending capitalism, actually. If you take his theory seriously, it's much more, we can call it today, a kind of social democratic view where the state would provide resources for all in practice. And if you look at what Locke actually did, in those days, people like John Stuart Mill and Locke, they weren't just theorists or philosophers, they were also social and political actors. After the Glorious Revolution in 1688, he was made a member of the Board of Trade. And this is what he said when he was a member of the Board of Trade of England. He said, everyone must have meat, drink, clothing, and firing. So much goes out of the stock of the kingdom, whether they work or no. Even those who do not work deserve basically the things that allow them to lead a decent life. Meat, drink, clothes, and so on. So why did he defend the money system, the money exchange system? It's not because he thought it's a great idea in principle. It's a bit like the view that Socrates 理论上他反对民主，但是他觉得其他的制度更坏。Locke 这样的也是这样，他觉得自由市场理论上是不好的，但是其他的制度更坏。He said the worst off in a kind of money exchange system are still better off than the rulers in subsistence economy. What did he mean by subsistence economy? He meant more like, now it's like United States, 北美, 当时没有什么政府，主要是17世纪的时候是基本上是很乱。他觉得当时英国的弱势群体比北美的统治者物质方面是更好，所以他觉得 money exchange economy 自由市场虽然是理论上是很不好，但是还是比其他的制度好一点。 So that's the law of nature. In the law of nature, we all have rights to life, liberty, and property, right? Let's call it qualified right to property. Everybody must have enough, and even if they don't work for that. The right to life, in other words, is more important than the right to property in cases of conflict. 他觉得生存权比财产权更重要。但是 how do we move from the law of nature, where you all have rights to life, liberty, and property, to one where we enforce a government, to one where we give power to a government that has the power to enforce those rights? How do we move to that situation? It's because of a social contract, 社会契约. Hobbes, Locke, Kant, John Rawls, they all work within the social contract tradition. Only if we could imagine some sort of contract that everybody agrees to form a government that has power over us, because it secures our basic interests, our basic rights to life, liberty, and property. Only then do we have an obligation to obey the government. How does this contract come about? Well, it is difficult to enforce the law of nature. Law of nature means rights to life, liberty, and property. In the state of nature, there's no government, so who can enforce the rights to life, liberty, and property? Nobody, right? Therefore, men, and it is men, not women, remember the feminist critique of the liberal tradition? It's 大男子主义的制度, right? All men agree unanimously, 大家都同意, to give up their powers of enforcement to political authority. We no longer have the power to enforce the law of nature. I can't use violence to enforce the rights to life, liberty, and property. Everybody agrees to give those powers to the government, to the state. Now, of course, 如果你看历史方面有没有这样的社会契约？他承认没有，但是 there's a tacit consent, 默许。我们可以看，基本上虽然大家都没有公开同意，但是有一种默示的同意 ，a kind of implicit or tacit consent, right? 包括现在，我们可以说，我们觉得。也有人说 有人说 不管是什么制度，大家都基本上都同意他们的一些政治制度，虽然没有公开同意，但是有一种默许同意，他会用这些语言 ，OK？ If people make use of legally protected property, then it shows that they consented implicitly to the system, okay? If I participate in a system where I buy and sell property that is protected by law, it means basically that I agree with that system. Okay? So, we all meet together in a state of nature, and we all agree to give up our powers to the government, our power to enforce the rights to life, liberty, and property. And then we agree by majority vote, 多数的, in an election to a particular form of government. So 大家都同意，都要通过选举的制度来选他们的政府 ，OK？ So 西方的制度现在是这样，对不对？西方的选举民主，每4-5年，每5年，所有的老百姓，所有的公民，理论上都通过投票的制度。而且理论上都是平等的投票，通过这样的方式，他们都选他们的政府。So this is the basic idea. It's very explicit. The people choose the representatives, 他们选他们的代表 and the representatives are accountable. Accountable meaning that they do not have absolute power. Their power is limited. What they must do is secure people's rights. That's the most important thing. They have to act in the interest of the people. They have to secure people's rights to life, liberty, and property. If they don't do that, as we're going to see, the people can rebel. The people can resist. They can rebel against an executive that interferes with the people's choice of deputies. So if we as a community, we vote for representatives, and then a president or a king or a symbolic monarch does not allow us to choose our representatives, we can rebel. 可以革命, 如果是这样的情况. Okay? Of course, 每一个政治制度有缺点，也有优点，也有缺点. The main disadvantage of the social contract is that it gives a huge increase in coercive power to the political sovereign, to our representatives who are controlled by the majority. We all gave up our rights to use violence. We all gave it up to our representatives. Now, that's good in a way, but it's also very dangerous because the political leaders can misuse that power, right? So therefore, you have to separate power. Remember, this is quite central to constitutional government in the Western tradition. You have to separate power, okay? So you separate it between the legislature and the executive power. So for example, in the United States now, as you see, you have a conflict between the legislature, the House of Representatives, and the Senate is the legislature, and the president, who is the executive. They balance each other in theory. They separate each other, and they have and now, as actually in the U.S., it's very clear where the House of Representatives, the legislature, wants to actively impeach, really meaning overthrow the executive, the president. You have to separate. They can't be in the same hands. And this system is more stable than pure monarchy or executive-led government, meaning like one president who has all the power in complex socio and economic conditions. But he still didn't worry so much about abuses of majority rule. 如果是多数人，他们还是选，比如说在美国, if they have the House of Representatives and the American president is all chosen by the majority, it's possible that they could abuse the minority people, right? So the American founding fathers, about 100 years later, worried a lot about that problem. And the two most famous papers, this is from the American Constitution, papers that were justifying the American Constitution, 10 to 51, they were meant to address the worry of majority rule by saying that factions, 不同的党派, 因为很大规模的社会有不同的党派，通过这样的制度可以衡量，不会有一些多数的人可以滥用那个社会的权利，或者国家的权利。我们等一会儿可以多讨论。